Cost-push inflation. Cost-push inflation is a purported type of inflation caused by increases in the cost of important goods or services where no suitable alternative is available. As businesses face higher prices for underlying inputs, they are forced to increase prices of their outputs. It is contrasted with the theory of demand-pull inflation. Both accounts of inflation have at various times been put forward, with inconclusive evidence as to which explanation is superior. Cost-push inflation can also result from a rise in expected inflation, which in turn, the workers will demand higher wages, thus causing inflation. One example of cost-push inflation is the oil crisis of the 1970s, which some economists see as a major cause of the inflation experienced in the Western world in that decade. It is argued that this inflation resulted from increases in the cost of petroleum imposed by the member states of OPEC. Creeping inflation. Creeping inflation is a type of inflation that occurs slowly and gradually. It is characterized by a steady increase in prices over time, without any sudden or dramatic changes. Creeping inflation can be difficult to detect, as it can be masked by other factors, such as economic growth. Stagflation, stagnation, and inflation. Stagflation or recession. Inflation is a situation in which the inflation rate is high or increasing. The economic growth rate slows, and unemployment remains steadily high. It presents a dilemma for economic policy, since actions intended to lower inflation may exacerbate unemployment. Walking inflation. This type of inflation is faster than creeping inflation, but not as fast as galloping or hyperinflation. It is harmful to the economy because it heats up economic growth too quickly. People start to buy more than they need in order to avoid tomorrow's much higher prices. This increased buying drives demand even further, and suppliers often can't keep up. More importantly, neither can most people's wages. As a result, you can be priced out of common goods and services. Demand-pull inflation. Demand-pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand in an economy is more than aggregate supply. It involves inflation rising as real gross domestic product rises and unemployment falls, as the economy moves along the Phillips curve. This is commonly described as too much money chasing too few goods. More accurately, it should be described as involving too much money spent chasing too few goods, since only money that is spent on goods and services can cause inflation. This would not be expected to happen unless the economy is already at a full employment level. It is the opposite of cost-push inflation, hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is a very high and typically accelerating inflation. It quickly erodes the real value of the local currency as the prices of all goods increase. This causes people to minimize their holdings in that currency, as they usually switch to more stable foreign currencies. When measured in stable foreign currencies, prices typically remain stable. Effective capital controls and currency substitution, dollarization, are the orthodox solutions to ending short-term hyperinflation. However, there are significant social and economic costs to these policies. Ineffective implementations of these solutions often exacerbate the situation. Many governments choose to attempt to solve structural issues without resorting to those solutions, with the goal of bringing inflation down slowly while minimizing social costs of further economic shocks. Wage inflation. In other cases, a rise in wages might cause prices to rise across an economy. In this case, companies have to pay their workers more, and they often pass on the increases to the consumer, which causes inflation in the price of goods and services. Wage inflation occurs when workers' pay rises more rapidly than the cost of living. It can happen when there is a shortage of workers, or in other situations where wages are driven up quickly. Scarcity inflation. Scarcity inflation occurs due to hoarding by unscrupulous traders and black marketers, so as to create an artificial shortage of essential goods like food grains, kerosene, etc., with an intention to sell them only at higher prices to make huge profits. Structural inflation. Structural inflation is a persistent increase in the general price level caused by changes in the underlying structure of the economy. Unlike other types of inflation, such as cost-push or demand-pull inflation, structural inflation is not a temporary phenomenon that can be easily corrected by monetary or fiscal policy. It is a long-term problem that requires fundamental changes to the economy. Comprehensive inflation. When the prices of all commodities rise throughout the economy, it is known as comprehensive inflation, also known economy-wide inflation. Sporadic inflation. When prices of only few commodities in few regions rise, it is known as sporadic inflation. It is sectional in nature. For example, rise in food prices due to bad monsoon represents this type of inflation. Asset price inflation. Asset price inflation is the nominal rise in the prices of stocks, bonds, derivatives, real estate, and other assets. Rising asset prices are potentially misleading signs of a growing economy. Even if the stock market grows or houses are more valuable, no goods, like those included in the GDP, are produced. Currency inflation. It is caused by the printing of currency notes. Deflation. Deflation is a decrease in the general price level of goods and services. Deflation occurs when the inflation rate falls below 0%, a negative inflation rate. Inflation reduces the value of currency over time, but deflation increases it. This allows more goods and services to be bought than before with the same amount of currency. Deflation is distinct from disinflation, a slowdown in the inflation rate, i.e., when inflation declines to a lower rate but is still positive. Galloping inflation. Galloping inflation is one that develops at a rapid pace, dual or triple-digit annual rates, perhaps only for a brief period. Such form of inflation is dangerous for the economy as it mostly affects the middle and low-income classes of population. Importantly, galloping inflation can precipitate an economic depression. Nevertheless, galloping inflation can still be accompanied by real economic growth. Open inflation. When government does not attempt to restrict inflation, it is known as open inflation. In a free market economy where prices are allowed to take its own course, open inflation occurs. Repressed inflation. Let's say that there is excess demand in an economy. Typically, this leads to an increase in price. However, the government can take some repressive measures like price control, rationing, etc. to prevent the excess demand from increasing the prices. True inflation. This takes place after the full employment of all the factor inputs of an economy. When there is full employment, the national output becomes perfectly inelastic. Therefore, more money simply implies higher prices and not more output. Semi-inflation. Even before full employment, an economy might face inflationary pressure due to bottlenecks from certain sectors of the economy. Chronic inflation. Chronic inflation is an economic phenomenon occurring when a country experiences high inflation for a prolonged period, several years or decades, due to continual increases in the money supply, among other things. In countries with chronic inflation, inflation expectations become built-in, and it becomes extremely difficult to reduce the inflation rate because the process of reducing inflation by, for example, slowing down the growth rate of the money supply will often lead to high unemployment until inflationary expectations have adjusted to the new situation. Running inflation. Running inflation is a condition in an economy where the prices of goods and services increase by 10% to 20% every year. It requires monetary and fiscal measures, else it can lead to the condition of hyperinflation. Wartime inflation. Inflation that takes place during the period of a war-like situation is known as wartime inflation. During a war, scarce productive resources are all diverted and prioritized to produce military goods and equipments.